morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to today's program. We are so excited at the Council Town Hall about bringing back our in-person events, beginning with an exclusive members-only tour of a new exhibit at the Skirball Center in July. We also announced yesterday that we are providing our members with a free subscription to the Daily Chatter, which is an international newsletter written by top journalists from around the world. So if you aren't a member, please consider joining by visiting our website. For those of you who would like to ask questions of our panelists, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, which will start in about 35 minutes. It is now my great pleasure to introduce today's program, The Future of Gun Policy and the U.S. Second Amendment, with Eugene Volokh, who is a Gary T. Schwartz Distinguished Professor at UCLA Law, Hannah Shearer, a litigation director at Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence, Rosanna Smart, an economist at the Rand Corporation. She's also co-author of The Science of Gun Policy. And our moderator today is Ben Christopher, a CalMatters reporter. Ben, we're so pleased to have you moderate today. And we have such a distinguished panel. It's such a timely topic based on the breaking news over the weekend.
Well, thank you, Kim. Thanks for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to moderate this important and obviously very timely discussion. And thanks to everyone who is watching from home or from their office or wherever they might be today. I wanted to introduce our three panelists in a little bit more detail. First, Hannah Shearer is Litigation Director and Staff Attorney at Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. As the leader of the Center's constitutional litigation program, Hannah also works to develop lawsuits advocating for gun safety reforms and for gun violence survivors, and she serves as defense counsel in actions challenging local gun laws under the Second Amendment. She also manages the Center's amicus brief program, in which legal experts participate in crucial firearms litigation as friends of the court. So Hannah Shearer, thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Next, we have Rosanna Smart. Dr. Smart is an economist at the Rand Corporation, where her research is in applied microeconomics with a focus on issues relating to health behaviors, illicit markets, drug policy, programs to reduce crime and improve police operations and outcomes, and the determinants of gun violence. She's also the lead author of Rand's The Science of Gun Policy, which, as a reporter who has had to write on gun policy before, is a really invaluable resource, which summarizes the research and evidence on the effects of different gun policies across the country. So Dr. Smart, thank you and welcome.
Thank you.
And last but not least, Dr. Eugene Volokh. Dr. Volokh has been a professor at UCLA Law School for over 25 years, where he has taught and written about the First Amendment law, criminal law, tort law, and for our purposes, firearms regulation policy, and among many other topics. His articles on the Second Amendment have been cited by judges in over 75 cases, including all three of the Supreme Court's modern Second Amendment cases, the Heller, McDonald, and Caetano cases, which I'm sure we will get into. Dr. Volokh, thank you and welcome.
Thanks very much for having me, but I should say I am not a doctor.
Oh.
Don't have a PhD, don't have an MD.
All right.
I have a Juris Doctor, but that's not customarily. One does not customarily title one to a doctor.
Understood. Mr. It is. So a conversation about gun policy and gun rights and, of course, gun violence is unfortunately always a very timely discussion in the United States, but it's particularly timely today. Some of the people who are watching may have seen on Friday evening, a federal district judge in California struck down the state's assault weapons ban, ruling that it was unconstitutional. And I think we can put assault weapon ban in quotes, both because assault weapon is itself a contested term, which is part of the whole debate and something that we might get into shortly. Also because it isn't a single statute, but a collection of state laws the first of which was introduced in California in 1989 after a mass shooting event at a school in Stockton, California, which really shocked the conscience of the state and the nation, as so many have since then, unfortunately. And so I did have some prepared questions for the panel to get to sort of the big picture of gun policy and the Second Amendment, but first I did want to just talk about this ruling because it is the sort of breaking news component of this discussion. So Hannah Shearer, maybe we could start with you. This ruling was written by Judge Roger Benitez. It was, I think, fair to say, fairly strongly worded, vociferous, maybe even inflammatory, depending on who you asked. He compared an AR-15 to a Swiss Army knife, which is something that got a lot of attention from the governor and the attorney general and national media. He said that knives are responsible for more deaths than rifles. He said that more people have died from COVID-19 vaccines than mass shootings in California. I should note that this ruling has been stayed, so the state law is still in effect for now. California's Attorney General Rob Bonta has said that the state will appeal, but Hannah Shearer, what's your take on this, and what do you think this means for the future of gun policy in California and across the country?
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for your question, and just wanted to also thank the organizers of the panel and my co-panelists, who I'm excited to hear from as well. The decision on Friday has gotten a lot of attention, as you mentioned, for the really shocking rhetoric and the comparison of of assault rifles to a Swiss Army knife. In other ways, I think the decision was not actually so surprising for those of us who closely follow Second Amendment law. There's a lot of disagreement among judges who are reviewing these types of challenges about how to deal with Second Amendment claims when people raise a Second Amendment objection to gun policies that are exactly the types of policies that we plan to discuss today and that are featured in the research evaluation that Rand did. There's disagreement, even though most other courts, I think every federal appeals court to look at the issue of an assault weapons ban has upheld it under the Second Amendment. There's been strongly worded dissents, including from Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who's now on the Supreme Court. So this view that there could be constitutional infirmities with policies like assault weapons bans is taking hold among the district courts and federal courts of appeal. And I think a lot of the areas of disagreement are relevant to another topic of this panel, the research. It seemed that this judge was looking for evidence that he wasn't finding, that he wanted to prove a negative, that California's assault weapons ban has led to specific incidents being prevented, mass shootings not happening. And of course, you can't, when the law has been in effect since 1989, you can't say for sure that there's a lower number of mass shootings with that law in effect. And then when it's not in effect, or other types of violence that these weapons may be used in. So I think there's a debate over exactly what level of evidence you need to show that a gun law is effective, and other judges have expressed that without using the inflammatory rhetoric that this judge used. And there's also been an argument in the courts over whether to even look at the evidence of a law's effectiveness, with some litigants arguing and judges believing that actually the only thing that's relevant here is the historical support for a particular type of gun regulation, and whether it's analogous to laws that we had at the founding of America or the adoption of the 14th Amendment. So I think if you look aside what I found to be really shocking rhetoric, this opinion is emblematic of a lot of the issues swirling around there with respect to Second Amendment jurisprudence and gun policy.
Mr. Volokh, I mean, Judge Benitez's ruling cites the Heller decision in 2008, which, as we noted, I believe that opinion cited some of your research and writing, and which really affirmed an individual's constitutional right to keep and bear arms, specifying that the Second Amendment isn't just about militias, but actually about individual rights. And there are, of course, limits on that right, as there are for any constitutional right. And as Judge Benitez wrote, a civilian can't own a bazooka or a howitzer, but he argued that assault weapons, so-called assault weapons, are, in his words, fairly ordinary, popular modern rifles, and therefore they don't cross that line. Is it obvious to you where that line is?
No, not particularly. I mean, I think there are different ways one can set up legal rules here, and the Supreme Court has given us some guidance, but not a vast amount. I should say, I think the whole debate about assault weapons is a red herring on both sides. So-called assault weapons are basically semi-automatics. They're not fully automatics, which are largely banned to the extent they're legal. They're heavily, heavily regulated, almost never used. Lawfully owned ones almost never used in crimes. Semi-automatic guns are quite deadly. They're often used in crimes, not rifles. Semi-automatic rifles are very rarely used in crimes, but handguns are often used in crimes. But these so-called assault weapons are really not materially more lethal than other weapons that remain available. So even to the extent the assault weapons ban in California actually denies would-be criminals access to those guns, which I doubt, but even to the extent it denies them access to the particular banned guns, they can get other guns that are basically just as deadly. So on one hand, it's unsurprising that there's really no solid evidence that these bans materially reduce either the homicide rate generally. Very few, again, of homicides are committed with rifles in any event, or even the mass shooting rate, which of course is a tiny fraction, thankfully, of all homicides. At the same time, they're also not a very serious burden on individual self-defense. You could imagine courts saying, and in fact, some courts have said, look, if they wanted to ban all guns, that would be clearly unconstitutional. If they wanted to ban all handguns, which are indeed quite different for many people than rifles, they're much more useful for many people than rifles or shotguns, that would be unconstitutional. That's what Heller said. But if you want to ban this particular kind of gun and still leave available all those other guns, not much of a burden on self-defense. So you can imagine an opinion written like that. And again, some opinions have been more or less written in those terms. The way I think of it is it's kind of like, imagine that we conclude, which is not implausible, that a huge number of crimes are committed by people in the influence of vodka. And we say, okay, fine, let's ban vodka. Well, all right. I imagine most people who can't get vodka will get gin, get equally drunk on gin or on whiskey instead. Some people might really prefer vodka, and somehow, you ban vodka and they'll drink something less dangerous. Or maybe you ban high-proof vodka, and most people would just drink twice as much of the low-proof vodka, let's say. But maybe it might have some effect. Very unlikely it'll have much of an effect. So again, I think the assault weapons discussion is largely a red herring. By the way, you can talk about other things like magazine size limits. I'm not sure that those are terribly helpful, but at least there you can imagine, okay, fine. If somebody has to reload after 10 shots, maybe that'll interfere with a mass shooting in a material way. But I think it's no surprise that the general, at least my general sense of assault weapons bans, and I believe this is also the RAND study along those lines as well, is that there's really no conclusive evidence that they materially reduce, again, even mass shootings, much less aggregate homicides, of which mass shootings are a tiny fraction and rifle shootings are a tiny fraction.
Well, it is interesting that you mentioned the large magazine capacity issue, because of course, Judge Benitez was also the same judge who struck down the state's large magazine capacity ban. So, Dr. Smart, we've been sort of circling around this issue of what the research does tell us about the efficacy of assault weapons bans, and to the extent that this is a debate and a legal argument that would be influenced by evidence, not just purely constitutional issues. What does the data show about state or federal bans on assault weapons?
Yeah, so Hannah and Eugene teed this up quite nicely, because yes, they're both correct that when we did look at the research evidence on the effect of assault weapons bans, and I think we also did look at high capacity magazine bans, for one, there were relatively few kind of rigorously designed studies that had evaluated the effects of these bans on various outcomes, including gun violence. And by rigorous design here, I'm meaning studies that have data both before and after the change in the law, as well as some comparison state, right? So again, that's going to be more plausible about the causal effect of the law than a study that just says, at this point in time, these states had the ban, these ones didn't, and these are the differences between them. And among the few studies that did have kind of meet this bar for rigor, they found really uncertain effects for the effects of assault weapons bans on, I would say, firearm homicides and mass shootings, which were the outcomes most commonly studied. So effects that could be consistent with relatively large decreases, relatively large increases, and no effect whatsoever. So I think again, as Eugene said, it's really inconclusive what the effects are likely to be. And again, repealing a law may have different effects than implementing a law, so that's another kind of caveat to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. And just staying with you, just going a little bit broader on this, I mean, when you listen to the public debate around firearms and gun policy, do you get a sense that this is a debate that is generally informed by data and evidence that you're looking at, or are there particular misconceptions or mischaracterizations or sort of, you know, maybe it might be an overemphasis on mass shootings over different kinds of violence that you see popping up over and over again?
Yeah, so I think in general, you know, different parties in the debates are drawing on data and evidence. And one of the issues that arises is that for a lot of these areas, the evidence is really mixed. And so whether intentionally or not, people can kind of pick and choose those studies that confirm their views and discount those that do not. And so I think the biggest kind of mischaracterization I see is that we have a lot more certainty around the effects of these policies than we actually do. And I do think another that you touched on, it's not really a mischaracterization or a misperception, but a tension I've seen in the kind of political discourse versus the actual data is a lot of our policy action and discussions are spurred by these kind of high profile incidents of public mass shootings in which usually a lone shooter, you know, injures or kills a large amount of people with victims selected indiscriminately. And as Eugene said, like less than 1% of all firearm homicides are from such incidents, which those incidents are also, you know, there's no official definition of a mass shooting. So people sometimes say mass shooting and they'll select which definition fits the story they want to tell. So it's interesting to me that these incidents, which represent a small fraction of all gun violence, often spur policy discussion around policies that are unlikely to have large effects on mass shootings, but may have large effects on other forms of gun violence. And that's always been kind of a strange point of contention between the data and the political discourse that I've seen.
Yeah. Do you have a sense of why that might be? Why there might be more focus on? Is it just simply because a mass shooting event is just so much more shocking than sort of gradual, reliable statistics?
To an extent, right? It really grabs the national attention. There's a lot of, you know, media coverage. I think, you know, local media sources may cover, you know, smaller incidents of violence, but are certainly the national news cycle is not drawn by local incidents of gun violence or particular communities that may have kind of persistently faced very high levels of gun violence. So I think these incidents kind of draw on a national fear potentially, right? That you could be selected, right? If we all kind of walk around in our daily, if many of us walk around in our daily lives not exposed to gun violence, these incidents kind of may spur emotions that lead this to kind of persist in the news cycle.
Right. So Hannah, Shearer, I mean, you craft litigation strategies at Giffords Law Center, and President Trump obviously reshaped the Supreme Court, but he also appointed, I think, 223 judges to district and appeals courts across the country. So I think it's fair to say he really left a profound mark on the federal judiciary. And I just wonder, what has that meant for gun law? And has the country, are we getting close to sort of an upper limit on what states and localities and the federal government can do to regulate firearms and regulate firearm owners, at least, you know, for now?
I think the judicial nominations have already had an effect on Second Amendment law, gun policy. The decision you referenced earlier on California's large capacity magazine ban, the Southern District of California struck it down, and it was actually, that decision was upheld by a panel of the Ninth Circuit, and the judge who wrote the decision had been appointed by President Trump, and now the court's going to go en banc and might reach a different outcome, but that's just one example. And in general, I think that his appointees to the courts have some more extreme stances on issues than judges appointed by past Republican presidents. And on gun policy, I can say that there's tons of judges have upheld assault weapons restrictions, concealed carry restrictions, and they've been appointed by Republican presidents and have generally conservative ideology to the extent you want to try to peg judges that way. And I think that the newest wave of appointed judges may be taking more extreme stances on the Second Amendment. It may even have been kind of a litmus test. You would see judges who would write a dissenting opinion on the Second Amendment, maybe as an audition for a higher position, and those decisions were ones that we paid close attention to when trying to figure out what the trends that are happening in the judiciary. And so now at the Supreme Court, there's 3 justices appointed by President Trump. All 3 of them, you can get some clues that they want to expand gun rights. The Supreme Court has just agreed to hear a case challenging New York City's law requiring a concealed carry permit to carry concealed handguns in public and meet a heightened standard showing that you have a special need to carry guns in public for self-defense. And I think that the justices that President Trump appointed are not looking favorably on this law, are likely going to be voting to strike it down, along with some of the other justices who lean more conservative. So I think it's had an impact, and we're just kind of waiting for the first Supreme Court case that for that impact to trickle down to more of the lower courts.
Gotcha. So clearly we still are sort of learning what the full legacy of the Trump presidency will be on gun rights. But Mr. Volokh, have you seen a major effect in sort of the changing parameters around what kinds of laws can be introduced around guns, at least at the state or local or federal level?
Not so far, but I do think it's not unlikely that Trump judges, both at the district court and court of appeals level, but especially at the Supreme Court level, might affect things. So let's take an example of a policy that really does matter. That's the question of concealed carry, and whether ordinary law-abiding adults should be entitled to carry concealed with a license, or increasingly many states without. Used to be in the mid-1980s, there were basically 10 states in which any law-abiding adult could get a license to carry concealed, except one of those states you didn't even need a license. That turns out to have been Vermont. Who knew? And then 40 states, either you needed a license and it was highly discretionary, it's basically the sheriff like you, or it was just completely forbidden concealed carry. The real gun policy revolution that has happened in the last 35 years is that number is flipped. Now there are 40 states basically in which any law-abiding adult can either get a license to carry a gun concealed, or carry without a license, which I believe is now 20 of those 40 states. So from Vermont to 20 states. And then there are only 10 states, including our own California, roughly 10, it's a few are hard to categorize, that are basically you're not entitled to a license, and in some places like LA County, San Francisco, virtually impossible to get. Interestingly, my understanding is in Sacramento County, for example, the sheriff just gives licenses to anybody who doesn't have a criminal record or no other reason to think that they're ineligible. So it actually varies quite a bit inside the state. So that's a huge, huge practical difference. And note, that might affect both crime rates, because you can imagine a situation where you say, look, we think that if you allow people to carry guns, then people who are otherwise law-abiding, but who might fly off the handle as a result of a fender bender or something, might have a gun ready in public and use it in a moment of anger. The hardened criminal, the mass shooter, isn't going to care about concealed carry license law, but these people on the borderline, mostly law-abiding but occasionally violent, those might. At the same time, it also, unlike assault weapons bans, has a huge effect on self-defense, right? That for many people, the places they most need to be able to defend themselves are in public and not at home, where they might have an alarm system and the like. So that's a hugely important question. And it looks not unlikely that the Supreme Court will basically require the remaining 10 states to fall in line with the other 40 by saying there's a right to carry. Probably technically it'll say there's a right to carry, not necessarily concealed. Just the state has to decide whether to allow open carry or concealed carry. And most states, since they don't much care for open carry, that's something from a different era for most people. It used to be in the 1800s, people routinely open carry, but most states today would probably not appreciate that. They would probably end up moving to allowing concealed carry. That is in fact what happened in DC and in Illinois, based on 2 Federal Circuit decisions several years ago. And it may end up happening now in the remaining few states that ban concealed carry, and that would, I think, in considerable measure be because of the Trump appointees. Not completely sure. It's very hard to predict these things with any real confidence, but it seems likely there'll be 5 votes for the proposition that law-abiding adults, especially ones 21 and above, who don't have criminal records, ought to be allowed to carry concealed again, like the result of this experiment we've had, where now in 40 states, which include lots of blue states as well as red states, this kind of broadly available concealed carry is legally secured.
Right. I think underlying this entire debate and sort of informing all of these discussions is the fact that the prevalence of guns and gun ownership in the United States is so large. So Dr. Smart, we did see this a really significant spike in gun purchases during the pandemic. There was a survey out of Northeastern and Harvard, which found that 6.5% of American adults bought at least one gun in 2020, and about a fifth of them were purchasing a firearm for the first time. And that adds to the population's massive stockpile of arms. According to Pew Research, about 45% of Americans say they live in a home with at least one firearm. So is gun ownership itself correlated with gun violence?
Yeah, so there have been quite a few studies trying to get at this question. The majority of this work is looking at community level rates of gun ownership, how community level rates of gun ownership and variation in that relate to variation in, let's say, firearm homicide or firearm suicide. And they're looking city level, county level, state level. And I would say in almost all of these studies, there's always some exceptions, higher rates of gun ownership at the community level are associated with higher rates of firearm suicide and firearm homicide. There have been some studies looking kind of at specifics of firearm homicide, distinguishing between domestic incidents involving an intimate partner or a family member versus kind of stranger homicides involving somebody you're not acquainted with. And the relationship, I think, is driven primarily by these domestic incidents. Now, big caveat here is we don't actually have systematic collection on gun ownership, right? There are these surveys, but systematic information on that would be able to capture representative data on state, county, or city level rates. In 2004, we had a large-scale national survey that provided these estimates, but that question was removed, so we no longer have that at the national level. So most of these studies are using proxy measures of gun ownership, the most common one being the percent of suicides that are committed with a firearm. So to the extent that you believe that that is a validated measure, and there is evidence to suggest it corresponds closely with gun ownership at these more aggregate levels, that's something to keep in mind. The other point to keep in mind is this is correlation. These are associated, and that's a different question than causality. So it's a little, the evidence on causality is less clear. There have been a few individual level studies that have looked at recent purchasers of firearms compared to some comparison group, and we can argue about whether that's an appropriate comparison group, and looked at their outcomes of, let's say, violent crime or firearm suicide. And recent purchasers of firearms do have higher odds of firearm suicide in particular. That's where the evidence is strongest versus those who did not recently acquire a firearm. And again, you can make the argument maybe they purchased the firearm for that purpose or not. But so the evidence points certainly to a positive correlation between these. But again, I think the causal question is where the evidence gets a bit thinner.
Right. So, Mr. Volokh, I mean, given what Rosanna Smart just said, and given that the Second Amendment clearly does put a cap on what federal, state, and local governments can do to restrict gun ownership, and are there other policies or regulations that would pass constitutional muster that you think we should be considering that we aren't in order to reduce gun violence, or are high rates of gun violence just a price that a country with a robust Second Amendment has to pay, do you think?
Well, so a couple of things. I think one thing that it's important to focus on is not the question of correlations between gun ownership and firearms homicide, because to the extent that there's going to be some, let's say somebody there are fewer guns, so there's less firearms homicide, but imagine there's more knife homicide because people can't use guns in order to protect themselves. Dead body's a dead body. So I think we should be focusing on total homicide. Now, it may be that you might say, if we do eliminate guns, gun homicides will decline, and knife homicides and other homicides will not take up the slack. That's possible. It's certainly something we should be open to. But again, we should be looking at total homicides and I think total suicides as well. I think suicide is an interesting separate question. A great majority of all gun deaths, or very substantial majority of gun deaths, are suicides. It's an interesting question. How much should an attempt to prevent suicide affect the rights of others? But again, I think we should be looking at the total homicide correlations. And my understanding is that, in fact, for that, the evidence is not conclusive, at least that, but Dr. Smart could perhaps flesh that out some. Then the question is, what can be done? And I think what we ought to be doing is we ought to be trying to figure out, as smart people, including I'm sure Dr. Smart, have been trying to do, is what happened from roughly 1990 to roughly 2005 or so, when the homicide rate, including the firearms homicide rate, plummeted, and by a factor of 2 or more. Not because I think of gun controls. I mean, there were some gun controls like the assault weapons ban, but it's quite clear that that could not have had anything like that effect, in part because so few homicides are assault weapons. And when the assault weapons ban was repealed, the rate did not go back up. Could it be because of greater concealed carry? That's the other thing that started happening there. Some people say that, I'm not sure. But something was done, or something happened. And we should be trying to figure out what happened. It may not be gun policy, but I take it our goal isn't to find the best gun policy to diminish homicide. It's to find the best policy to diminish homicide. At the same time, we have found that in the last year or so, as best we can tell, the homicide rate has spiked, possibly by as much as 25 to 30%. I think the full data is not yet available. And again, we ought to try to figure that out. I don't think it's because of changing gun laws. I don't think it's also because of the increase in gun ownership. There has been an increase, but not sufficient, it seems to be, even for gun control advocates to draw that kind of connection. So we should be trying to figure that out. But I think it seems pretty likely to me that whatever policies we come up with, whether it's more policing, less policing, different policing, more incarceration, more decarceration, some mix, that's going to be more likely to be effective than attempts to control guns, in part because, and this is the last point, it ties in though to your first, there are about 400 million guns in the country today. You know, it's kind of like with drugs. If we could snap our fingers and all drugs, all addictive drugs vanished, would that be better? Well, maybe. I mean, libertarians may object to that, but you could imagine that may be better. Maybe if we could even eliminate all alcohol, it would be better. But, you know, we tried to eliminate alcohol, didn't seem to work. We've been trying to eliminate drugs. Not clear that that's on balance a help. I just don't see what viable policy is going to make it harder for people who are willing to commit murder or robbery or rape or other serious crimes to somehow decide, oh, I'm going to comply with a law related to guns, especially given the vast stock of guns available that will satisfy America's criminal population for a century, I'm sure, even if somehow we could outlaw all of them. Not that I would suggest.
I'll tack on.
Yeah.
Let me quickly follow up.
Please.
So the same studies do tend to find similarly positive associations between, again, the caveated measure of gun ownership and community level rates of total homicides or total suicides. It's weaker in part because there isn't an association with these non-firearm related events. But I completely agree. I think this question of the extent to which changing gun deaths will simply lead to replacement by other means is a key issue in the gun policy debates. It does seem to be a key point of contention between those who support more restrictive versus more permissive policies.
Gotcha. So we are coming up on our 11:35. So we want to take questions from some of the audience first. But so one more question just for Hannah Shearer. So we were talking about the legacy of the last president on gun policy, but President Biden has proposed a number, I'm not sure actually if he's already signed some of them, a number of executive orders already on homemade ghost guns, on providing funding for violence intervention programs and so forth. And so I wonder, you know, from your perch at Giffords, what difference does having Joe Biden in the White House compared to Donald Trump mean for national gun policy and law?
Yes, I can definitely address that question, the executive orders. I just wanted to respond to Professor Volokh, because I agree with a lot of what he's saying about the evidence, but I don't agree with the last point he made, just that questioning whether any law could really affect criminal conduct. I think a lot of the policies that organizations like mine are recommending, and even some of the research is suggestive at this point, is effective, do try to get at the problem of guns that are out there and potentially going to be criminally misused. I think, one law that's been extremely effective was a law from 1934, the National Firearms Act, that didn't prohibit machine guns, the most, the most lethal gun technology of the time, but required people to go through a background check and get a license and pay a tax, a pretty hefty tax. And so, it is possible to address. It's difficult when there's so many firearms out there and there's new technologies coming onto the market, but I think it would be possible to have some kind of a licensing system that addresses the stock of existing guns. And the limitation there, I think, has just been political will. That's a very controversial idea, to think about requiring registration of guns that people already have. And I think that's been the barrier, as opposed to any kind of a Second Amendment objection. And then I also think another important policy area to raise are laws designed to restrain people from doing harm before they carry out a violent or criminal act. So think about domestic violence restraining orders that let victims of domestic abuse get a court order protecting them, but also removing guns from their abuser, because that's an incredibly lethal situation. That turned recently into the extreme risk protection order policy that a number of states have adopted, to try to get at the problem that sometimes when someone is planning an act of violence or even to harm themselves, there's lots of warning signs that people's families and law enforcement can act on, but they don't often have the legal authority. So just wanted to give a few examples of policies like that. And then with respect to your question, I think that the executive orders that President Biden has proposed, some of them fall into the category of what I think your earlier question got at, policies that don't raise a constitutional problem but have the prospect of being incredibly effective, funding for community violence intervention programs, trying to get at the causes of gun violence in the most impacted communities. And then I think the other thing that's going to have a huge impact is addressing ghost guns, just because it's a completely unregulated area right now. People building their own guns, and they're spiking use in crime. In some parts of California, it's 30% of guns recovered in crime are untraceable self-assembled firearms. So that's a crucial step, and could make a big difference just by the fact that President Biden came in with a commitment to adopting executive actions like this.
Good. And on that the sort of ghost gun issue, or sometimes you hear them called unfinished receivers, these are the problem here, as you might see it, is that these are guns that you can mill at home or in a workshop, and then they don't necessarily come with obviously a background check or a serial number that can be tracked. Is that the main concern?
That's right. So there's hobbyists who have an interest in building their own guns, but these a lot of companies seem to be marketing to people who are trying to avoid a background check, trying to avoid putting a serial number on their gun, just want to be completely off the books. And so that's the issue, that there are companies that are selling gun parts and the means to assemble it as easily as you could put together IKEA furniture.
Which is not easy. Sorry.
But so then they'll sell the tool for the people who have trouble with IKEA furniture, which is there's these jig kits that really just drill the holes for you. And these aren't regulated at all, like firearms. And in states like California that regulate traditional guns very heavily, criminals and traffickers are turning to ghost guns instead.
Yeah, I mean, just anecdotally, I went to a gun show a few years ago for a story I was working on, and in California, where so many other types of firearms are so strictly regulated, and the sale of certain firearms is so strictly regulated, these at least at the time, these unfinished receivers were, I want to say about 40% of the stalls were selling these products, just because it's the sort of the newest thing. So it is 11:40 now, so I wanted to bring on Jessica, who I understand might have some questions from the audience. So Jessica,
yes,
welcome.
I do. Yes, thank you so much. We have a lot of complicated questions, so we'll try to jump right into these. The first question, and I don't know who would like to jump in on this, but is the Second Amendment still valid? Of course, it legally exists and is binding, but should it be? Perhaps it is impractical to repeal it now, but times do change. I think the question and ensuing discussion is important. So Eugene, do you want to start?
Sure. So I think it's important to recognize that all constitutional amendments are subject to themselves being amended. So, for example, some people think that the Fifth Amendment, privilege against self-incrimination, is a bad idea. Why not ask people when they're criminal defendants, what's your side of the story? And if you don't tell us your side of the story, we'll suspect the worst, right? Likewise, people have some uncertainty about the Fourth Amendment, about restrictions on searches and seizures. Some people would want to broaden that, some people would want to narrow it. So we should always be open to that, whether it's free speech or Establishment Clause or Fifth Amendment or Second Amendment or whatever else. It is the law, and we have to comply with the law so long as it's there. I'm inclined to say that it's probably a good idea, because I think there is a basic human right to self-defense, and I think that needs to include the right to useful weapons that really help defend one. One way of asking this is you see all these signs that saying protected by armed patrol on people's lawns. I've never seen a sign that says protected by unarmed patrol, right? People feel, I think reasonably, that guns are a powerful deterrent for them. And that's why I think a lot of people, indeed, probably 40 to 45% of all households have at least one. The one other thing I think to keep in mind is, returning to the point we heard earlier about registration, I actually don't think that gun registration would be unconstitutional. I think the courts would uphold it. I think free speech rights. There is some right to anonymous speech, but if you want a parade, you may need to get a parade permit. That's something that's generally allowed for various kinds of constitutional rights. But understandably, people who own guns are worried that gun registration will facilitate future gun confiscation. And when you have, for example, our current Vice President, Kamala Harris, who was talking about how there ought to be mandatory gun buyback programs for certain kinds of guns, which really is a confiscation, possibly backed by home searches, although with some compensation being offered, people worry about that. So curiously, if we really had, if there was really security for gun rights, if people really knew the Second Amendment wouldn't be repealed and wouldn't be reinterpreted by a future liberal Supreme Court. Today, the Supreme Court seems 6-3 conservative, but it could be different in several years. Then I think various kinds of moderate gun proposals, people might say, let's try it out. Let's try gun registration and see. But when people hear, oh, there are all these people out there who are interested in repealing the Second Amendment or interpreting it into essentially nothingness, and having mandatory gun buyback, which is to say gun confiscation programs, then they worry, oh, every little step might be a step down the slippery slope. So if we could have a real coalition about protecting gun rights at their base, through the Second Amendment and through the political process, but at the same time, then that might actually facilitate moderate steps. Whereas to the extent that gun owners feel that their rights are in jeopardy, that makes them worry about even moderate steps.
Thank you. For Rosanna, do you know how often guns are used as a deterrent by civilians, or how many crimes have been stopped because of the presence or use of a gun?
No, is the short answer. So this is again, uses of guns for self-defense. The kind of best data we have are national. You can get this broken down however you want, but it's justifiable homicides by private citizens, which is notoriously not an accurate measure defensive gun use, right? Like a homicide, it's the most extreme version, and then there's issues there, and depending on your state, a certain homicide may be considered justified or not, such as like whether the state has a stand your ground law. So I think the short answer is no. Estimates vary hugely, and I'm not even going to throw them out there just because I think they're so problematic. There's certainly incidents where it occurs, obviously, like we get this anecdotal evidence, but I actually think a huge gap in our data and our understanding of the effects of laws that might help address some of the concerns by those who are opposed to certain laws would be having this better data on how often guns are used in cases of self-defense.
If I could just briefly chime in, I just want to elaborate a little bit more. First of all, I totally agree with Dr. Smart. We don't know. It's one of the many things that's very hard to know. By the way, it's true in many areas. Like my understanding is prevalence of drug use is often hard to measure because people may not tell the truth about it, right? Certainly defensive homicides with guns are a tiny, tiny fraction of all potential, gun uses, defensive gun uses. Among other things, people, when they want to defend themselves with a gun, their goal isn't to bag a criminal and leave a dead body on the carpet, right? Their goal is to make the criminal stop and go away. So as best we can tell, that I've seen studies from ranging survey-based data from about 100,000 a year to 2.5 million a year, with various in the middle. And there are definitely problems with all sorts, very hard to tell, but that just shows how hard it is to measure, to measure this. But also the questioner asked, how many are deterred by guns? And that's something like, whom are you going to survey? I guess you can survey criminals. There was a 1980s era study which surveyed incarcerated criminals, asking them, were there crimes that you were planning that you were stopped from or deterred from when you learned that the target would have had a gun? And many of them said, yes, absolutely. That was one of the things. Obviously, these are people who weren't deterred by the law. They were prisoners. That's how they found these people to ask. But they were deterred by private gun ownership. But how that translates in the population at large, extraordinarily difficult to tell.
Thank you. For Hannah, if assault rifles represent a very small percent, sorry, my question just jumps. We're getting so many in here. If assault rifles represent very small percentage of various categories of gun violence, are efforts to ban new sales and possibly prohibit existing ownership counterproductive to achieving better and constructive gun control, such as universal background checks, red flag laws, and improved ATF tracking?
Thanks for the question. I think you can disagree about how to rank these different priorities. I mean, what's clear to me and my organization is that we're very far away from having, reaching the limits of what types of regulation the Second Amendment might allow. It's a small number of states. I think it's 7 or 8 states that that restrict assault weapons, like California does, and so this isn't. This isn't a policy that's sweeping the nation. This is what a few states have adopted in response to either at the same time as the federal assault weapons ban or in response to that ban expiring. I'd also argue that it's okay to address a small type of problem in terms of numbers. I mean, governments have regularly adopted policies in response to terrorist actions that are very rare and haven't recurred. And so if there's a particular form of violence that's really disturbing to the public, like a mass shooting, I think that California is entitled to pass regulations to try to address it. And we've been talking about whether this type of restriction does successfully address it. But my answer to the question of whether it's worth addressing is, I think yes, even if it might be better to start with other policies, as I think California has done with its more comprehensive set of gun laws compared to the rest of the country.
Thank you. This questioner says, I would like to ask the panelists to discuss a very recent failure in the last few days of the California legislature's failure to pass bills that would have raised the taxes on handgun and ammunition sales. So have you seen taxes on handguns and ammunitions be effective deterrents, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, taxes on handguns, like many taxes, are effective at imposing a greater burden on poor people than on rich people. Used to be quite commonly people would make this argument, say, yeah, I don't mind that some rich guy living next to me has a handgun because he's not going to go out there and use it to rob people. Whereas those poor people down in the poor neighborhood, that's where the crime is. And indeed, the crime is more common in those neighborhoods. And therefore, we need to make it harder for them to get guns. You know, that's a position that I think one can argue for. The difficulty is, I think poor people should be as entitled to defend themselves as rich people. And if you do impose a tax, if you impose a tiny tax on guns, it won't have any effect, really. If you impose a hefty tax on guns, then the consequence is going to be that it's going to have little effect on relatively prosperous people because, you know, they buy guns maybe, if not once in their life, a few times in their life. But on people who are near the poverty line and who are living in a bad part of town and who are especially vulnerable to crime, it may make it harder for them to get those guns, or may make them criminals themselves, because then it would lead them to go to the black market. That's handguns. Ammunition, or guns generally. Ammunition, the effect would be different. If you impose a really high tax on ammunition, it would essentially make it very hard for people to learn how to use their guns safely and effectively. Because if you want to do that, you have to go to the shooting range. And like with so many things, you have to have a good deal of experience in the shooting range. Typical trip to the shooting range, people will maybe fire 100 rounds, sometimes a lot more. And it takes a while. It takes a while so that when you shoot at someone, or not somebody, something, that's the shooting range. We don't shoot at people. When you shoot at something, that takes a while for you to learn how to do that really effectively. So if you jack up the taxes, people will go to the shooting range less often. Will that affect criminals? No. Even if you tell a robber or a murderer, you know, every round you shoot is going to cost you $2. They're going to say, okay, fine. Well, most of the time when I rob people, I don't even have to shoot my gun. And if I do, presumably I'm looking for something more than $2. That's just a tool of the trade for the criminal. That's just a sound investment for them. But if you tell somebody who's interested in going target shooting this, you say, okay, fine, maybe I'll go once, maybe I'll shoot a few rounds, maybe I won't be as safe and well trained because it just becomes too expensive to do. That's going to be the effect of higher taxes on ammo.
I have an additional comment on that, which is just that the California bill, the firearms and ammunition tax, it was going, the money raised from the tax was going to go to fund violence intervention programs. So a program called the California Violence Intervention Program, CalVIP, that's aimed at community-based strategies, not gun regulation, but intervening in communities that have high rates of violent crime. And so I think in that respect, a tax that isn't designed to suppress gun ownership or ammunition purchases, but yet raises enough money for a program like that, could have a positive impact reducing gun violence if the underlying programs are effective. But, you know, it depends on exactly the variables that Professor Volokh was talking about, setting it at the right rate. And then, you know, the model for this is there's a tax that's been around for 100 years, a federal excise tax on sales of guns and ammunition, where the money raised goes to wildlife conservation, because back in the day, the problem with you know, gun use and hunting was depleting the deer population or whatever. And so this raised money that helped you know, conserve wildlife in response to this noted problem with gun ownership. And so it's a little bit the same thing. Like maybe, you know, a tax could help address the consequence of gun violence through the revenue raised, not through any effect in suppressing purchases of firearms.
Well, if I could just chime in, it's perfectly free to budget funds from other taxes like the income tax, property tax. Income tax is particularly, at least that's borne more actually by the rich than by the poor. Free to raise to spend money from that for violence prevention. When it tries to do violence prevention by imposing a tax on a particular product, I think people assume that that's in part because they're trying to make it more expensive for people to use that product. One example is, imagine that you wanted to fund treatment for people who have pregnancy-related conditions, including complications from abortions. So you put a tax on abortions. I think many people who support abortion rights will say, it looks to me like they're trying to make abortions less available. If they just want to provide better treatment for people, they could just fund it the way they fund other healthcare, rather than targeting a constitutionally protected right for extra taxation.
And if I could just chime in on the politics of this, just because the question was about the state legislature, and I spent a lot of time thinking about that. My understanding is that the reason that this didn't pass with a supermajority, which was required in the state legislature or in the assembly, is less a reticence to impose new restrictions on guns and more of a reticence to impose new taxes, because the governor has come out and said he's averse to increasing taxes at all this year. So just to provide that context.
Thank you, Ben. All right, this next question, is there a way to pursue reform by shifting the focus or liability to manufacturers? It seems people will be less likely to protest or vehemently oppose restrictions or requirements that are not directly imposed on them, even if subject to later order effects. Any thoughts on that?
Well, we already do regulate, or that there are regulations, but also tort liability for manufacturers producing guns that blow up in people's hands. So if you're talking about safety measures, there already are tools for dealing with it. That's not the concern. The concern is with the criminal misuse of guns. So one question is, so how do we generally deal with criminal misuse of products, especially very broadly available products? Generally speaking, just one classic example is alcohol, right? Alcohol leads to probably about as many deaths of innocent bystanders as guns do, probably more deaths of the users. There are more alcohol-related deaths of the drinkers than there are gun suicides. But if you look at the alcohol-related homicides, drunk driving, and just murder and manslaughter as a result of people being drunk and angry with each other, it's about the same as the number of gun homicides and gun accidents that kill other people. And, we don't go after vodka companies because some people misuse their vodka. We do go after abusers of vodka, that is to say people who drive drunk. We do go after people who sell to people who aren't allowed to drink vodka, and that's actually part of this debate about background checks. But I just don't see the propriety of going after gun manufacturers for producing products that are lawful, and that most people who use them use perfectly legally, and then a small fraction, unfortunately, misuse in extremely dangerous ways. Now, what the politics are, I'm happy to leave to others, but that's my sense of the policy.
I would just add that I don't think manufacturers have done all that they should do, or maybe even would do if they were subject to litigation without there's a federal immunity law that protects them from certain types of litigation for when it comes to especially unintentional shootings, which is a small fraction of gun deaths, but there's handgun safety measures that could be implemented, things like a chamber load indicator or magazine disconnect that could be included in handguns to make them safer and reduce unintentional shootings, and manufacturers have resisted doing that. And so I think that there could be a role to pursuing gun manufacturers, whether formally in litigation or just urging more responsible practices. But it isn't currently a focus, including for a couple of reasons, including because of the federal immunity law.
Perfect. This will be my final question. Underlying the issue of guns in America are the issues of trust, feeling safe, and mental health. Why are these issues neglected in gun reform discourse?
I think in
Rosanna,
part they're very difficult to tackle, and they're also, I think, broader than gun violence, or gun outcomes in general, right? But I do believe that kind of mental health has come up in the discussion and the policy discussion, sometimes in ways that are probably not very productive and are stigmatizing. But I know that there's evidence, right, that improved access to mental health care can improve violence outcomes and can prevent violence more broadly in communities, among which is gun violence. But I think they become a bit more nebulous. And it is in part problematic, I think, that often the focus of gun policy is on the guns themselves versus kind of the broader societal barriers that lead individuals to suicide or homicide. But it does become a bit trickier to put that specifically in the gun policy debate versus kind of the violence prevention debate. But they're connected.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. This hour flew by, so I'd love to continue this conversation at a future date. But for now, Ben, I will turn this conversation back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. And yeah, ditto. I have a ton of questions I had hoped to ask and could ask. This is clearly a conversation that we could have for much longer. But I'll just have to leave it at this. And thank you to everyone who participated. Hannah Shearer of the Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence, Dr. Rosanna Smart from the RAND Corporation, and Professor Eugene Volokh at UCLA School of Law, UCLA School of Law. This has been an interesting, informative, remarkably civil, and obviously timely discussion. So thank you to all three of you, and thanks to all of you who watched along from home or at work. And I hope you found it informative. So thank you, and with that, I will turn it back to Kim.
This was amazing, considering the complexity of the issues that you all discussed within an hour's time. We are so appreciative of helping us navigate through these complex issues. We need to bring you back because we need more time with you. So thank you so very much today.